Love him or hate him, Paul Maurice is just 2 wins away from a cup final. Let's talk about that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, we have some fun topics to talk about. Obviously, for the Jets, there's not a lot that's happened recently. It's been pretty quiet. I think Winnipeg is very focused on the offseason, and so they've been, relatively not secretive, but I think in terms of being very forward and forthcoming about their current upcoming plans, not a lot of news. So in the meantime, it's more about like former Jets and, whether it's players or coaches that have kind of been in the news lately. And one of them, of course, is Paul Maurice. We have a number of Jets actually in this Cup Finals, which is really funny to say, a number of former Jets, whether it's players or staff. So congratulations to them. Somehow Evander Kane has ended up in his own Cup Finals, which, yeah, you probably know how we all feel about that. Not exactly endorsing that too much. But, for Paul Maurice, Dmitry Kulikov, and guys like that, I'm sure folks will always feel relatively connected to him. So in terms of the Paul Maurice thing, right, I have some mixed feelings about that. Not because I don't want him to win, but, man, does it feel like it should have been us. We'll talk about why that continues to be a theme in just a quick moment. But before we go any further, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Download the FanDuel app and make every moment more, because right now new customers can get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Now, like I said, seeing Paul Maurice doing really well is obviously, on the one hand, a good thing, right? Maurice, I think, gave a lot to the Jets, and in many respects, we kind of owe him a lot. I think he did a lot of stuff on the backside of this team and really helped the Jets to become a more professional organization, which by and large really seems to have happened. It's popped up in a few media reports in the past. There's been rumors that he had a huge role in pushing the Jets forward. And so for all intents and purposes, this is relatively, I wouldn't call it like factual, but it sounds like it's pretty legit. So in many ways, the Jets probably could not have taken the step to where they are now without his contributions. And had he stepped away not long after the 2017-2018 run, he would have been like immortalized in the city, right? Let's be real. Maurice was one of the most successful coaches we've ever had, and it made his downfall all the more painful. You really thought that he was the guy who was going to get the Jets to the dance, and unfortunately what ended up happening was, well, you kind of saw that injuries made his lineups a little bit better. And once he trusted those lineups, he definitely stuck with them for the most part. But you had moments where, like, he would bench Enstrom or something, and it put the Jets at a really big disadvantage, and also reportedly caused some real rifts in the locker room. I know people always looked at Enstrom as a short guy, and, sure, he is a smaller, undersized defender, but he was actually very good and very smart about how to cut down those passing and shooting lanes. And so when it comes to the locker room not really agreeing with Maurice's assessment, that's not the best place that you want to be. But, for all of that, obviously he made his own separation, and it seems like, since going to Florida, it's just been all positive. I mean, they're, in a second straight Stanley Cup final. It looks like they're actually going to win. They just beat Edmonton 2-1, or actually 3-1. Sorry. Oh no, sorry. It was a higher scoreline because they had a couple of late goals. But I mean, the general theme was like after the first game where the Panthers were poor, and frankly got bailed out by Sergei Bobrovsky. Second game, they won like 4-1. And off of this effort, it was a lot more of the Panthers creating good offensive opportunities, really defensively limiting the Oilers, and especially McDavid. I thought McDavid was generally pretty quiet, despite having some really good individual shifts where it looked like he might score. There were a couple of moments where he actually did get like a breakaway, and I think it was like Tkachuk or Bennett who was sort of draped all over him and probably should have gotten called for a penalty. There were also some lowlights. The Draisaitl leaping charge into the side of Barkov's head that ultimately sidelined Barkov for the rest of the game. And that single moment, if Barkov is slated to miss more time, could really shift this whole series. Barkov is a huge part of why the Panthers are super successful. And like Lundell's been great. Make no mistake. He's done a great job as your second line center. But he is not Barkov, not yet. And perhaps never will be. And so replacing Sasha, I just don't know how you do that. Now, thankfully for the Panthers, they are very deep and they're a good team. But I think this is one of those losses that's a little more than just your average NHLer. And I think we all know why. Barkov is an elite franchise center. He's probably one of the few players in this team, or really in this whole series, that, aside from like Draisaitl, really comes anywhere near within McDavid's stratosphere. I mean, Connor's just at a level above everyone else, and so finding people who can even enter his orbit is pretty challenging, but Barkov is one of those guys. But yeah, I mean, as far as how I think the rest of the series is going to go, like the Oilers are going to have to win a game. I'd be really surprised if they got swept. I know Maurice did it a few years ago, back when the Jets were not so good, and quite honestly, Hellebuyck really stole that series for the Jets. I don't think that's what's going to happen here. For as good as Bobrovsky's been, and he's been brilliant in this series to date, I just have to imagine that at some point the Oilers are going to squeak one through. A win somewhere for them would be, I'm sure, a huge confidence boost. I'm not really rooting for that, if I'm being honest. I think I'd prefer that they just kind of get it over with and Maurice gets his cup. I think that's probably the most preferable option here for me. Not that I, hate the Oilers any more than anyone else, but I think if I have to choose between two of these teams that I'm not particularly fond of, I'm probably going to choose the one with more Jets connections, generally speaking. I guess where I'm a little bit salty is that it just feels like it should have been us, man. I can't help but sit there and think, man, that was like our chance a few years ago. That should have been us in the same position. But, Marc-Andre Fleury just had to ruin all of our fun, huh? So it is what it is at this point. We've talked about how magical that season was. Probably best not to think about it too much longer, because I think all we'll ever feel is just a little bit of pain from what was a clear missed opportunity to go all the way. But for Maurice, if he does finish this out, congratulations to him. I know this has been one of the more elusive achievements in his career. He's certainly been around the league long enough. He's one of the longest tenured coaches we've ever seen for the Jets franchise. And certainly in terms of being an employed coach, he's definitely one of those guys that has somehow survived quite a few different crises when it comes to teams. With the Panthers, it's really just been, for the most part, all up. I mean, it seems like that team was built for him. He's got tons of depth to work with. The front office seems to be on the same page. So, hey, if it works for them, it works for them. And it seems like it's almost about to work for them enough to a cup final win. Let me know who you're rooting for, or if you think, the Oilers might come back in this series, especially if Barkov is out, or are you thinking that this is going to be a clean sweep? Drop your predictions for the remainder of the series in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. While we're at it, I thought I would also pivot a little bit and sort of focus. We just talked about some former Jets. Let's talk about some future Jets. And I want to say, I want to call Heinola a future Jet for a particular reason, because I think he's about to enter the lineup. And I had some interesting conversation with somebody on a previous comments section about, whether or not Heinola is really worth it, right? Because, there's a suggestion that maybe even Kyle Capobianco is actually better than he is, which I've got some thoughts about that. I know that this is always a great place for some good back and forth. So we'll talk about where Heinola really fits in the grand scheme of things and why, in particular, his skill set's probably needed for the Jets more so than what you might expect for like a Capobianco or some of these other depth defenders. We'll talk about that in just a quick moment. But before we go any further, just wanted to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. Summertime means baseball, the NBA Finals, and of course the Stanley Cup Finals. And you can bet it all on FanDuel. If you are following the Cup Finals and you think the Oilers have a chance of coming back after a 2-0 series deficit, well, this is your chance to put your money where your mouth is. Maybe you really feel like this is the opportunity for McDavid to finally get his cup ring. Maybe you're actually thinking the Panthers are about to do it again and actually make good on their second shot. You know, the Panthers have come close before, but this time it seems like everything is firing on all 4 cylinders. And even when it's not, guess who is? Sergei friggin' Bobrovsky. So regardless of which team you're rooting for, right now new customers can get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. And guess what? There's plenty of opportunities to win with all of these wonderful different stats, lines, props, odds, and so much more. That's $200 you can use to bet on everything from the Finals MVP to who's going to hit one out of the park in your next baseball watching experience. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and add a big win to your summer bucket list. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for joining us on tonight's episode as we are just chatting a little bit about some fun stuff for the Jets, former Jets doing well, some current Jets, or perhaps maybe we'll call them future Jets who are in the ascendancy, maybe some guys who are about to play a major role for their respective teams, hopefully. I think one of the guys that I've thought about a lot recently, though, especially when it comes to the defensive side of things, it's Ville Heinola, right? And I know that he's sort of a divisive name, but I think most people are probably ready to see him actually make the NHL. And I want to talk about why, in particular, he presents a very interesting prospect for the Jets back end, especially with his particular skill set. And we'll talk about that in just a quick second. Before we dive into that, though, just wanted to reach out to all you Fox Sports or ESPN watchers. If you find yourself having to turn down the volume because of all the shouting, you should make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you daily to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, like I said, Ville Heinola, this feels like it has to be his season, and I know that we've said that in the past. This past year, it was actually looking like it was going to happen. Heinola was really on track to make the Jets, and had he not broken his ankle, I think things would have been very different. That injury was, quite honestly, pretty horrific. I don't know how many of you have ever talked to folks who have broken their ankles or had really serious ruptures in that region. It can be a nightmare to rehab, and I think it had a pretty decisive impact on his season. For one thing, he had a much shorter Moose season than he would have had normally if he'd been fully healthy. Well, assuming he stayed down with the Moose, right? I think the most likely scenario was he would have been on Winnipeg's third pair. He was playing really well to the point in preseason where Bones was kind of talking about him making the team. So I don't really think it was an imagination that he was likely to join the Jets. And had he joined Winnipeg, you probably would have seen, guys like Stanley or one of Schmidt or something riding more pine than you would have expected. But unfortunately for pretty much everyone involved, he had a horrific injury, and that basically submarined his season even before it started. And so when I look at sort of the points totals this year, obviously Capobianco has always been one of those guys who's like a really high-scoring Moose or AHL level player. And, what's kind of unfortunate for him is that he has a lot of the tool sets and skills to be an NHL player, but like the foot speed and decision making at the NHL level, that was kind of the one thing that was really holding him back. Had he been able to sort of adapt that to the NHL level, you'd probably have seen him with the Jets, because in terms of like being a prolific skater and quite honestly a prolific offensive piece, he's been that at the AHL level, and really it's never quite translated at the NHL level. You'll see him kind of have moments where he's looking more like Neil Pionk. And that's where Heinola was kind of more suited to the NHL game. If he is like finally healthy and his ankle is relatively healed up, which at this stage it should be, he's had surgery, he's had, a whole year to rehab it basically. I'm hoping that he'll be relatively in good health come preseason and training camp. this is probably the year that he really has to get that spot. I think he's going to have a big camp, and I think you're going to see him be very confident in moving the puck, passing out from the back, and really creating those zone exits. I think that's one of the biggest things that the Jets really struggle with is getting out of their own end, and that's where Heinola is typically an expert. Where I think a lot of the Jets defenders traditionally struggle is, when they're skating with the puck, especially from their own end, they get themselves into trouble. It's not exactly a unique phenomenon. It happens a lot. And unfortunately for the Jets, it's part of the reason why they get scored upon as often as they have in the past. This year, Hellebuyck was much better at stopping some of that stuff, and Winnipeg's defense generally as a team was pretty darn excellent. But even still, you had moments where occasionally you saw somebody make a really silly turnover or get themselves into trouble or make a bad pass from the back. And unfortunately, it ended up in the back of the net. So if you want to avoid that stuff, you've got to get more mobile. And honestly, just in general, the mobility would be a really big help for the Jets because, their offensive creation tends to not be at the level of most elite teams. They've certainly scored a decent amount, but you notice this past season, Winnipeg really relied on goaltending and team defense to kind of carry a lot of the season, which is, it's not terrible, but I think if you're looking at a squad like Edmonton or Dallas or the Panthers, right, you notice how good they are at 5v5 in terms of chance creation. Well, perhaps they were during the regular season, maybe not so much for the Oilers right now. But, that notwithstanding, most of the teams in the postseason that have gone far have generally been teams that were able to really drive 5v5 offense rather than just purely defending. Sure, they might have all been good at that in some capacity, but in terms of like being an elite shutdown team while perhaps not, generating as much offense, most of those teams weren't doing that to the same degree that Winnipeg was this past season. So, I think Winnipeg probably needs to adjust how they create this year, and having a player like Heinola on the left side who can be a lot more mobile, who can move the puck effectively, and who can also perhaps quarterback a power play, I think that would be really helpful. We've kind of gotten used to the Jets power play QBs being like Morrissey and Pionk and some of those other guys, but to be honest, the Jets don't really have like an elite power play defender. They've only had guys who have done it okay-ish or decently well, but not somebody who's like a really elite distributor on the back end. And that's where I think Heinola is a much more apt fit for this kind of role. He's done it a lot with the Moose, and I think with his hopefully, full health, back to full strength being a major factor this upcoming season, that it's going to help him really seize like the second power play role. I think that would be great for him. Like, we're not going to expect him to replace Morrissey. That's just not happening. So I think we should, sort of temper our expectations there. But maybe Arneal will feel differently. I don't know. Scott has kind of talked about being, more data focused and more open-minded, which to me suggests he might rethink some of those traditional roles. But there's just some stuff that I wouldn't really expect or ask him to like shake up, just because you have to kind of read the room sometimes and understand how much you can get away with. There's some stuff that like he's going to have to be pretty firm with and put his foot down on, but there's other stuff where I think he's going to have to be sensitive, right? And make sure that he doesn't sort of alienate the room and himself, in the first couple of months. So, tricky road to really navigate there. But I think Heinola is definitely one of our best power play quarterback options. I think he's going to show that this upcoming season. I think you could see him have like a 20 to 25 point year, which if that's what he can do for your third pairing or something, that'd be pretty darn great. It's a little ambitious, but I feel like with what we've seen from him, should he stay healthy, there's reasonable chance that he could actually accomplish this, especially if he gets power play time. If he does that on the second power play unit, I could see him really having a strong season, and maybe this is where he'll really earn his big payday in the future. But I don't know that he's going to ever quite live up to the potential that he had when he was first drafted. But if he becomes like a good second or third pairing kind of guy, I mean, at this point, that's really what Winnipeg should be getting from him. I think it'd be great. It's nice to fill some roster gaps internally, and I know he's been waiting a long time for this chance to really step up and have that opportunity. His game has always been suited to the NHL. I think he's going to be a very modern style of player for the Jets, and hopefully he just stays healthy and really gets the chance to grow in this role at this level. So stay out, kind of stay aware and keep on the lookout for him. I'm hoping that this is his big season. And if it's not, well, it is what it is. Perhaps he'll find a role with somebody else who can get the most out of his skill sets, because it's clear that he's very talented. It's just in the past he had trouble putting it all together. But based on what we've seen from some of him recently, I'm kind of thinking he's getting there. So last step, and really hopefully the last stop, NHL with the big Jets. But of course, that's easier said than done. On a kind of a related note, one thing that I think hasn't really been discussed a lot and is a bit of a present concern for the Jets is, aside from the defense, right? Who's going to be, Hellebuyck's backup? I think that's a bigger question that we haven't really thought about a lot, and I want to dive into a potential couple of options and scenarios here in just a little bit. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just wrapping up with some thoughts on Winnipeg's backend. Obviously, that's been a bit of a concern for the Jets, more so on the defensive side of things with the blue line than it is in net, but that's about to change this offseason because Laurent Brossoit is going to get paid, and it's not going to be by Winnipeg. I think at this point, Brossoit has really earned the right to find a spot somewhere where he can get a chance to really be a starter. I think that's great for him. I'm really excited, and I hope that he actually lands this role. It's unfortunate that he'll have to leave the Jets because as a backup for Hellebuyck, he kind of kicked butt. I thought he did a great job. I'll always be grateful for what he did to support Helly this past season. It was like going back to the previous year or two where he was having a monster season, earned that right to go out to Vegas and try and make a name for himself. Didn't really work out at the same degree that I think he was expecting, but he got a cup ring out of it, so I guess he's doing pretty okay for himself. But now he'll get a chance to be a starter. He's going to be one of the top free agent options, which probably doesn't say a lot about the free agent class. And for the Jets, I think it also means that you've got to really scramble and figure out who your backup is going to be. Now, the most likely option and one that could work out is if you try Thomas Milic. But I think, to be honest, Milic is probably not ready for the NHL yet. He's kind of bounced around a little bit the past year with, Manitoba and Norfolk, and his numbers in both leagues are okay. I don't know that you're looking at a 900 or a 908 and thinking that this is going to be, the guy to really carry you forward in the backup role. I know the Moose weren't great this year. And so, Milic's numbers may have suffered a little bit, this being his first real pro season. But I just think it's a lot to ask him to then jump into a backup role for Hellebuyck, who, quite honestly, needs more time off. I think that's one theme that probably will come up this upcoming season. Hellebuyck shouldn't be playing 60 games a year. It might be better to start to dial it back a little bit, right? And have the second stringer eat up maybe closer to 30 or 35 starts. I mean, that's a little bit much, but I think at this stage, your backup really has to be able to eat a few more games and give Hellebuyck some rest heading into the postseason. I feel like, every year that we see them in the playoffs, it seemingly hasn't been great for Helly, except for the 1 year he swept the Oilers where he was just on one. This playoff run, I mean, not all of it was really on his fault or was on his shoulders. A lot of it was not his fault. The Jets were just bad in a lot of areas, and it was very poor mismatch. But, he also wasn't great, if we're being honest. So, a tough mixture here where you need somebody who's willing to eat starts, but is also going to give you at least league average, hopefully above league average, because league average this year was really, really low. That being said, if the Jets are not really comfortable using Milic in this role yet, well, the free agency market's not going to be great. You've got a couple of choices, and Well, you could start off with like Chris Dreiger, I guess. I don't even know what he's like these days. I remember he had an okay spell with the Kraken, but like generally speaking, I don't think anyone's looking at him to really be leading the way. Um, this past season with the Kraken wasn't like terrible. I think it was okay. You know, he only had a couple of games, so it's really hard to get a sense. But like you're probably looking at the previous seasons, and you're seeing a couple of different things, right? He had like 27 odd games with the Kraken the year before or 2 years before, and it was like a 900. And then in 2020 and 2021, he had like a 938 and like a 927 in like 15 to 20 games, which seems all right. Dreiger really didn't play at all this past season. He just had like 2 games and it was like a 920. So I mean, it's hard to really read too much into that sample size. My guess is he'll probably be closer to like a 905 or something if he was to play it out for like 20-ish games. Maybe that's okay. I don't know. I don't know what league average is going to be this upcoming season, and there's some speculation, but I imagine that what we saw with goalies this year probably not going to go away anytime soon. You could also check in to see if Eric Comrie is willing to come back. Comrie has kind of been in and out of the Jets system. I think at this stage of his career, he's probably not worth really investing much cash into. I like him as a dude, and I think it would be fun if he came back. But I think at this stage, Comrie's probably not going to be capable of much more than a handful of starts. It seems like he's really fallen off, and at this stage, Winnipeg is kind of in a tough spot, needing to get some pretty decent performances out of the number 2. I guess if I'm looking at some of the backups out there, the guy that I might have some interest in is like Wedgwood, maybe. Wedgwood, he's a tough one. Like he had some okay stints with the Stars in previous seasons. This last year was not so good. He was around league average, which league average this year was pretty low. But like if he's like $1 million or something, I mean, that's relatively cheap, and I don't think you would be too disappointed with getting like a 9.5 or like a 9.05 or a 9.10 out of him. I mean, like, again, it's not great, and maybe the Jets' defensive structure would be really helpful for him here, but I think if you're asking for him to be bailing you out every night, you're probably not going to get that out of him. The guy who would probably be able to do that if you were willing to pay up is maybe like Anthony Stolarz, but Stolarz is probably going to be a starter somewhere. I feel like of most of the options out there, there's just not that many goalies who are going to be capable of eating starts at a high level, especially a high volume of them. Most of the goalies this free agent class are kind of at best replacement level, and so Stolarz is going to be expensive. Brossoit is probably going to be expensive. You're going to have to do some settling, and that's why the Jets maybe just go back to Milic. I think it's a really tough call, and I think it's a bigger influence on this upcoming season than perhaps people would be willing to admit. But all I can say is I hope the Jets make a decent decision. The backup role is going to be one that probably needs to give Hellebuyck more rest, and I don't know who out there is going to be willing to play like 25 plus games for the Jets. It's got to be somebody halfway decent. I don't know that Arneal's going to have as much defensive solidity this upcoming season as Bones did. Maybe he'll use some of the same techniques and systems. Maybe he'll be a little bit conservative. I don't know. I can't speak for his thinking on this. He might want to take more chances, and if that's the case, the goalie is going to have to do more work. So all that to say, it's a tough question. I think Winnipeg has a very scant few options in net, and most of them are not great. The fact that I'm looking at Wedgwood, Comrie, there's Nedeljkovic, Stolarz. I mean, you're kind of digging around through the scrap heap for some backup help. So let me know what goalie you think should be the backup. If you think it's Milic or somebody else, maybe you think that there's somebody else in Winnipeg's system that's going to be capable of doing it. To be honest, you're asking me. I don't really know who out there is going to do the Jets justice and really Hellebuyck justice. Winnipeg really does need help on the back end in terms of like the defense. And now that they're going to have a bit of a goalie hole, I mean, I just don't know what you do. The G position is a little bit on the weak side. And I think for Winnipeg, you just have to hope that somebody internally is capable of really elevating and becoming a number two who can be reliable. If that's all that you get, I mean, I'm pretty okay with that, but we'll see how that goes. But again, let me know what goalies you're hoping join the Jets here over the next couple of months in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow for even more Jets coverage. So see you then. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.